Maybe one more thing I can mention, which is linked, of course, with the rest, and most certainly with the cosmological issue, is notions about religion. I had to teach a course from the beginning, and I was very, very intrigued on let's see, on how anthropology could at least start a discussion or invite a discussion on such deep and still rather I might say forbidden topics like religion. I was invited a couple of times by theologians to do a little thing. For example, one paper on baptism. There was a whole book by a theologian from Louvain at some point. That's in Dutch, yeah, it's in Dutch, on baptism. So what they do then is have the history of baptism and of different artifacts that are used, etc., etc. But they invited me, and I did a little piece which later became a piece of a book on religion, first in Dutch and afterwards in English, where I say, well, if you look at what might be more generally called name-giving ceremonies with birth, around the world you find very different ceremonies, but probably always, or every cultural tradition, I should say, sort of marks birth. There is a new individual coming into the community. That's a unique thing, coming out of nowhere, so to speak. It's a really new, fresh human being, and this human being has to be integrated. And there's lots of stories of anthropologists who go and try and do field work, start field work with a particular community. And first they have to undergo an initiation ritual because they are not existing. They have to symbolically be born into, so they get a ceremony. For example, one of my other students, doctoral students who worked with, came from Lévi-Strauss, and who worked with the Kayapó in Brazil. He was undergoing such a ceremony with naked, etc., and he was reborn. He was completely shaven for that, because he had a beard. Yeah, of course, he can't be born with a beard, that's impossible. He had to be naked, so bald and naked, and yeah. And he said afterwards to me, yeah, I warned them that I would be ugly without my beard and my hair. And nevertheless, it had to be done. So he was undergoing the ceremony, and afterwards he says, yeah, you were really ugly. But well, it had to be done like that. Okay. So baptism is just one form of marking this coming into a community, being given a name, of course, and being entered as a social unit, as a social human being. So now, if you look at Christianity, then at the Christian baptism, which was my main contribution to this for this little piece, I said, well, if you look at what St. Paul is writing, you see that he is struggling, if you like, with a struggle that is still not determined or not approached with an open-minded mentality, I think, within Christianity. That is with the so-called heathen traditions. in this case, we can look at the so-called Eastern traditions, in fact, already the Eastern European traditions, that, at least in my view as an anthropologist then, Saint Paul at the time was living in and reacting to. Now, what were these traditions? Basically, they were all over the place, not only in the European context, of course, the Mediterranean context, but probably all over the world, as far as we can see, shamanistic traditions. Now, why do I think this is relevant for Paul and for the idea of baptizing in the Christian way, the Christian theology? If you read Paul and the letter to the Romans, I think it is, where he explains how baptism and baptism should be understood according to the Christian view, which is still the Orthodox view, still the way Christians should see baptism. Then he says, you know, there was the Christ, who, of course, as a deity, if you like, a godlike figure, the Son of God, came here, was killed, so disappeared from the earth, from community, but also from earth, and then stood up again and rose to heaven for eternity. So what this Christ did, this Christ figure, or this incarnation of God, incorporation of God did, was, of course, follow, Paul doesn't say that, I say that, he follows the shamanistic way. Shamans, in contrast to ritualistic traditions like Hindu traditions, or in contrast to the mythological traditions. In the beginning was the Word, so Christianity, for example. Shamans follow the axis of the world, as they say. That is, they symbolically die and are resurrected. They stand up. They leave their own body, they say. The mind leaves their own body, or the soul, and comes back in it, so it gets reborn. And then the shaman tells what he or she has experienced, has seen in this other dimension, this other world. Now, what the figure of Christ is doing, literally in the description of Paul, who was living in this shamanistic context at his time, in Greece and all over the place, is interpreting early Christianity, the life and death and resurrection of Christ, according to me, in shamanistic terms. The Christ is born here, dies here, is killed here, is resurrected. So literally his soul leaves his body, he comes back again, and then leaves for eternity, for this other world. That's really the voyage of the shaman that the shaman is talking about. Now, of course, what Paul is saying there is, according to me, is referring to what everybody knows, so-called, at his time, what is in the environment, what's part of the environment, but then immediately adding, and that's the main part of his message, of course, that we should get baptized, and that is to be understood not as I'm using these words, he's not using these words, as a shamanistic voyage, but as a sort of symbolic version of it. Indeed, when you're baptized, you are a heathen, to begin with. You're born or you're living for several years as a heathen, as a non-Christian, and you're dying symbolically, and by the baptizing, you are coming to life again in a new life, in an after world. And that's the meaning of being Christianized, literally, and that's the reason the missionary has his task or her task there, because they have to pull as many people as possible out of this former world, let's say, and die from this world and be reborn in the real world, which is the world of the New Testament, etc. And you do that through baptism. Now that's of course a very unorthodox way of telling the story of baptism, Christian baptism. But if you look at it, I mean, I read this letter of Paul literally in this way, and I can see why he talks this way, because that's its context. And he tries to sort of convince people to leave part of this context and come to something that's very similar, but that's a step forward into the Christian era, and by this baptism really. And that's why he says you shouldn't do this literally, which is the claim of some shamans at least, that they do this literally. They leave their body and come back. They fall in coma or whatever. You shouldn't do this literally, like the Christ did before you, but you should do it symbolically by baptism. But in fact, it's the same voyage that he is describing, I think. Well, and that's my anthropological interpretation of this so-called very different, but very likely, very similar, I think, sort of transition that is being described there. Now, if you go along, and that's what I try to do here in this book, The Creation of God, if you go along this way, follow this sort of reasoning, develop this sort of reasoning with different other notions, then you're getting a very intriguing reinterpretation, I think, reshuffling really, of the field of what's being called religious studies, where you find, when I try to delve in this, you find a lot of struggle, a lot of fights. It was a Protestant who started the comparative study of religion, a Dutch Protestant, Van der Leeuw, over a century ago. But you see that he, in a sense, intellectually stayed home as much as possible. He didn't want to leave the concepts of Christianity to begin with, and even more of Protestantism that he was acquainted with. But he wanted to integrate everybody else, this typical same sort of movement. And that was, according to him, comparative study. He said, yeah, they have this too, like we. And then they have other elements, but that's where they're failing to see the light, right? But they have, for example, baptism, they have this too, like us. And that's comparative study, is then saying, it's all the same but slightly different, but we are the main frame of reference to use in order to understand the others. Now my feeling as anthropologist then is saying, no, that's not enough. I think you have three main approaches, let's say, in what we call religious. One is this very practical sort of religious activities that we call shamanism, and that's strangely enough spread all over the world, although there certainly was no mission work there. It's probably the oldest that we know. You find it everywhere, and it's very practical. If you have a problem, like for example the part of the ceremonial activities of Navajo, the religious activities if you like, is shamanism, where you have a problem, you go to a shaman, and she or he will go into this experience of leaving his or her own body and come back with a solution. Most of the time a sort of symbolic message. And then say, well, now go into one of the medicine women or medicine men and go and have this particular ceremony, and then ritually you will come into that good line of living that I'm indicating here with my symbolic answer. That's the role of the shaman, and that's how it's worked out with them. But these two things, the ritual on the one hand, ritual religious activities on the one hand, which are very elaborate, could take 5 to 9 nights in a sequence, so that's very, very elaborate. And the shaman, which is sort of short, a one-day visit and consultation of this shaman. These are very different ways of acting religiously. They don't belong in one system or something. There isn't any consistent system for the combination of both. They exist one next to the other. And apart from that, we have the one that we know best in a more purified form, in the sense that a more exclusive form, that is having religious experiences and activities on the basis of a word, of a myth. In the beginning was the word. This John Gospel, where in fact, first of all, there is an entity, in this case the one God that exists, only one God, or the one real God then, you should say, in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, who has told human beings, he has spoken and has told human beings how things are, how they came into being, how they are, and how they should be respected, continued from now on. And so you first have this text, everything's in there, everything you need to know in order to live a good life is in there, and the text is the frame, is the basis on which to act religiously. That's very different from pure ritualistic traditions. There are a couple of them, for example, some Hindu traditions, where you have no text. There's a couple of religions of the 6,000 and some religions in the world. There's a couple of them, not many, where there is pure ritualistic activity and no text at all, no myth. For example, in the north of India, there are several traditions, groups like that, and if you ask about what is the meaning of this, they say, that's nothing that's interesting for us. We don't reason that way. It's such and such that you should do. End of the line. As Christians then, or Christian trained people like all of us, that's very awkward. We want an explanation first, so that we know we're doing the right thing or something. We're not acting stupidly, we're acting sensibly. In a ritualistic tradition, you act according to how you should act. That's it. No meaning attached. For us, that's very, very strange. You undergo things and you don't know what it means. Yeah. And the third one then is the shamanistic. I think these are three different ways of being religious, let's say, or religiously active. And most of the time, probably, and for example, also with Navajo, and I think also with Christianity, then you have two or three, a combination of two or three. Sometimes one is repressed, like for example, the shamanistic elements in Christianity are pushed backwards. They shouldn't be recognized, they shouldn't be named like that, but if you look carefully, they're there. You have magic, as you know, in Christianity, but it's white magic. And then you have the wrong magic, the black magic, that's described, that's from the heathens. But we have, do you have magic or not? I mean, or is it only the word? Well, you have this sort of combination, but we solve the problem by saying first the word and then some magic, but only part of it. So you have a combination, right? If you're religiously active, no. We're first the word comes first. No, that's your ideal, but in fact you have a combination. And most of the time, Navajo use myths, but as a sort of story to go along with parts of the rituals that they're performing. But somehow you have the feeling that you have the shamanistic activity, that's one. You have the ritual activity, that's two. And then you have added some stories, that's three. So it's that sort of combination. And I think throughout the world, that's a suggestion, let's look at this large field, this immense field of religiosity, let's say. Let's look at it from this perspective rather than through the only Christian glasses. We're looking at it mostly through Christian glasses, which means that, for example, speaking of myself then, and some of my friends, of course, we are calling ourselves, or we are named by others, atheists, non-believers. Now, atheist means that you are not a theist. And theism means that you start from the word, right? Start from the myth. and not starting from their myth, let's say, I'm a non-theist, an atheist. But that's not characterizing how I'm busy with this sort of material, with the meaningful life, with that sort of choices, etc. Maybe with mystical experiences. I have mystical experiences, I value them, etc. But they're not within that frame of reference which is called Christian. And they say, no, you're atheist. No, that's not a program, and that's saying that I'm not like you, okay, but I have my program of my own, or we have, etc. We are what we call spiritual atheists or religious atheists. No, that's impossible, because religion is theism, etc. Okay, so if we leave that Christian perspective as if it's a scientific perspective, that's what comparative religious studies do most of the time. They use a sort of stricter selection of the Christian concepts, of course, to look at everybody else. And then they go and compare. I say, no, this is just one case. The whole Christian framework is one case, and you can have a meaningful life with that or not. That's not my question, that's not my judgment either. But it's not a scientifically correct way of looking at all the others. I think you have these three types of behavior, which we call religious, shamanism, ritualistic, and mythological perspective, and combinations of these, and then see what people are doing, how it takes shape in particular cases. And if we start looking at comparison from that perspective, we get a different field of religion. For example, the presence or absence of a God figure, let alone one God figure, which is of a different reality, supernatural, superhuman. That's a minority of traditions, religious traditions, reason along this line. There are, I don't know how much, but probably a couple of hundred traditions where there is no God figure at all, but they do a lot of rituals. So, are they busy religiously? I would say yes, as an anthropologist. Are they busy in a sense that a Christian would call it? Yeah, no, but it's different. It's another way of being busy with the religious material, with maybe mysticism, with spirituality, etc. And if you need a generic term and you use religion, that's okay, but then it's not only the religion of a creator God, let alone one God, not this dualism of another world and this world, immanism and transcendentalism, etc. These are reserved as categories, as ways of thinking, are reserved to this Mediterranean line of working first and foremost, and maybe also some others, but it's just one line. So that's the sort of approach to get out of this reductionism, in fact, and this exclusivism, which is bothering a lot of the Protestant researchers in that field, where they accuse each other. This goes very very far. I mean, one of the people who's doing this, who was very, very close, let's say, to the sort of point that I'm making here, was a colleague from Harvard, Smith, he was called, who developed this attempts, far-going, really interesting attempts of social scientific approaches in theology, and he was trying to go for worldwide comparisons, and at some point, because he started to make that sort of distinctions that I've been suggesting here, he was working in the theology department of Harvard, and they removed him, and they put him really at the edge of the campus. And there he could do his business, but no, it's not serious really. Can you imagine? They felt like this is going too way out, it's not exclusive enough. He's denying that there's only one God, or that there's a possibility of being serious without this one God, etc. It's really amazing. It's sort of got into it's really a struggle, mostly among Protestants, because you have the whole range there of fundamentalists who wouldn't allow any margin, of course, to those who, like the Unitarians, for example, who say that any book, any symbol is okay. They're also Protestants, but they're very broad-minded, and the first ones are, of course, extremely narrow, and this sort of struggle is going on there. The same in the Jewish circles, the Orthodox Jews versus from Antwerp, for example, versus the cosmopolitan Jewish groups that you find in Brussels, very liberal-minded. I mean, there's a tremendous different cosmologies, if you like, in the end. There are links, but they are so different, and one refuses to work with the other one, of course. I mean, this is a classical. And the same in Islam. You have the same sort of narrowness and minding the limits, and of course trials when you go over the limit, and you know, it's, and then trying to go from there to a science of religion, you're stuck. I mean, you have to get out of your parochial limits, and it's very, very difficult, apparently. But anthropology can, you know, maybe do suggestions there, but well.